Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Frontier and watched the stars move past the main screen. The ship was 3 days out from Earth on a routine patrol mission when the communication officer turned around with a worried look on her face. Lieutenant Amy Carter had been working the radio systems for 2 years, and Jake trusted her judgment completely. "Captain, we're getting a distress signal," Amy said while adjusting her headset. "It's not from any human ship, and the language is completely unknown to our computers." Jake walked over to Amy's station and listened to the strange sounds coming through the speakers. The voice was clearly in distress, but the words made no sense to him or anyone else on the bridge. He had heard many alien languages during first contact situations, but this one was different somehow. "Where is it coming from?" Jake asked while studying the star charts on the nearby screen. "About 6 hours away at maximum speed," Amy replied. "The signal is weak and getting weaker every few minutes." Jake knew that helping unknown aliens could be dangerous for his crew. Earth's government had strict rules about first contact situations, and most of them involved calling for backup before doing anything else. However, someone was clearly dying, and Jake had never been good at following rules when lives were at stake. "Set course for the signal," Jake ordered. "Maximum speed." The New Frontier changed direction and began moving toward the source of the distress call. Jake spent the next few hours reading everything he could find about the region of space they were entering. Most of it was empty according to Earth's star maps, but that didn't mean much since humans had only been exploring space for 50 years. When they arrived at the coordinates, Jake saw a ship unlike anything in Earth's databases. It was beautiful, in a way that human ships were not, with smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to glow with their own light. However, it was also clearly damaged with several large holes in its hull and no signs of movement. "Life signs?" Jake asked his science officer. Lieutenant Ben Murphy ran his scanners over the alien vessel and frowned at the results. "One life form, very weak. The ship's power is almost gone and life support is failing fast." Jake made his decision quickly. "Prepare the shuttle bay. I'm going over there with a medical team." "Sir, regulations require us to contact Earth Command before making contact with unknown alien species," his first officer, Commander Lisa Hayes, reminded him. "By the time we get permission, whoever is over there will be dead," Jake replied. "I can live with breaking regulations, but I can't live with letting someone die when I could have helped." Jake put on his spacesuit and took Dr. Carl Wilson and 2 security officers with him to the alien ship. The airlocks were different from human designs, but Jake managed to figure out how to open them after several minutes of careful study. The inside of the ship was dark, except for a few emergency lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. They found the alien in what appeared to be the ship's medical bay. She was lying on a table that looked like it was designed for someone. With her body shape, and Jake could see that she was badly injured. She had pale blue skin and silver hair that fell past her shoulders. Her clothes were torn and stained with what Jake assumed was blood, though it was purple instead of red. When she saw the humans enter the room, her eyes went wide with fear, and she tried to move away from them. She spoke in the same language they had heard on the radio, but her voice was much weaker now. "Easy there," Jake said softly while removing his helmet so she could see his face. "We're here to help." The alien woman looked at Jake with confusion and said something that sounded like a question. Dr. Wilson began scanning her with his medical equipment, while Jake tried to communicate using simple gestures. He pointed to himself and said, "Jake," then pointed to her and raised his eyebrows. She seemed to understand and whispered something that sounded like Lyra. Dr. Wilson finished his scans and looked worried. "She's lost a lot of blood and has internal injuries. I can treat her, but we need to get her to our medical bay immediately." Jake nodded and carefully picked up the alien woman. She was lighter than he expected, and she didn't resist when he carried her to the shuttle. During the short trip back to the New Frontier, she kept looking at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. In the ship's medical bay, Dr. Wilson worked for several hours to stabilize Lyra's condition. Jake stayed with her the entire time, partly because he was curious about her species and partly because she seemed calmer when he was nearby. When she finally woke up, she looked around the medical bay with obvious surprise. "Where am I?" she asked in perfect English. Jake was shocked. "You speak our language?" "My people learn many languages," Lyra replied weakly. "It is necessary for trade and diplomacy. You are human, are you not?" "Yes, I'm Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth ship New Frontier. What's your name and where are you from?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "I am Princess Lyra of the Celestial Dominion. My escort was destroyed by pirates while traveling to a diplomatic meeting." Jake had never heard of the Celestial Dominion, but he could tell from her manner of speaking that she was used to being treated with great respect. However, he had never been impressed by titles, and he treated her the same way he would treat any injured person. "Well, Princess, you're safe now. Dr. Wilson says you need to rest for a few days while your injuries heal." Lyra looked confused by Jake's casual tone. "You do not bow or show proper respect for my rank. I respect you as a person who was in trouble and needed help," Jake replied. "Your title doesn't matter to me one way or the other." Over the next 3 days, Lyra stayed in the medical bay and observed the human crew. She was surprised by how efficiently they worked together and how they treated each other as equals regardless of rank. She was especially puzzled by their obvious loyalty to Jake, who never gave orders by screaming or threatening punishment. On the 3rd day, pirate ships appeared on the New Frontier's sensors. There were 4 of them, and they were much better armed than Jake's exploration vessel. The pirates sent a message demanding that Jake surrender both his ship and his alien passenger. "Not happening," Jake told his crew over the intercom. "Everyone to battle stations." Lyra watched from the medical bay as Jake directed the ship's defenses. He never panicked or raised his voice, instead calmly giving orders and encouraging his crew. When the pirates attacked, Jake used tactics that Lyra had never seen before, turning the New Frontier's weaknesses into advantages and using the enemy's overconfidence against them. The battle was over in less than an hour with all 4 pirate ships either destroyed or fleeing. Not a single human had been killed, though several were injured. Lyra realized that she had completely misjudged these humans and their strange captain who treated a princess like a regular person, but fought like a warrior when his people were threatened. 3 more days passed before the New Frontier reached Harmony Station, a massive structure that floated in neutral space between several star systems. The station served as a meeting place for different alien species to conduct trade and diplomatic business without the complications of visiting each other's home worlds. Jake had been there twice before, and both times he had felt like humans were barely tolerated rather than welcomed. Princess Lyra was fully healed by the time they docked at the station. She stood next to Jake on the bridge and watched through the main screen as they approached the enormous structure. The station was easily 100 times larger than Earth's biggest space stations, and ships from dozens of different species were docked at its many ports. "Your people built this?" Jake asked while studying the complex design. "The station belongs to no single species," Lyra replied. "It was built by treaty between the major powers and is administered by a council of representatives. However, the Celestial Dominion provides most of the funding and security." Jake nodded and prepared to escort Lyra to the docking bay where a Dominion ship would be waiting to take her home. However, when they arrived at the meeting point, Lyra surprised him by refusing to leave immediately. "I require more time to study human capabilities," she announced to the Dominion officials who had come to collect her. "The princess has the right to conduct intelligence gathering as she sees fit." The lead official, a tall alien with features similar to Lyra's but more severe, looked uncomfortable with her decision. "Your Highness, the Queen expects your immediate return. She is concerned about your extended contact with these primitives." "The humans saved my life and defeated 4 pirate vessels while doing so," Lyra replied firmly. "They deserve proper study, not dismissal based on outdated assumptions." Jake realized that Lyra was making excuses to stay near him and his crew. He wasn't sure why, but he decided not to ask questions since he was curious about her people as well. The Dominion officials agreed to wait for 1 week before escorting the princess home. During that week, Jake and Lyra spent most of their time together exploring the station and observing how different species interacted with each other. Jake noticed that there seemed to be a strict hierarchy among the aliens, with some species clearly considered more important than others. Humans were near the bottom of this ranking, barely above species that were considered primitive or warlike. On the 4th day, a serious problem developed that threatened to shut down all trade on the station. 3 different species had a dispute over mining rights in a system that contained valuable resources. The Zentari claimed the system based on ancient territorial agreements. The Vorth insisted they had a stronger claim because they had actually surveyed the planets first, and the Hegemony argued that they should control the system because they had the military power to defend it from pirates. The normal diplomatic process had completely broken down after 2 days of negotiations. Each species had walked out of the talks at least once, and there were rumors that some of them were preparing to send warships to settle the matter by force. If that happened, Harmony Station would likely be destroyed in the fighting. Jake watched the failed negotiations from the observation gallery and listened to the same arguments being repeated over and over again. Each species was focused entirely on proving that their claim was the strongest, while completely ignoring what the others were saying. It reminded him of children fighting over a toy, instead of adults trying to solve a real problem. "This is hopeless," Lyra said while sitting next to Jake in the gallery. "They have been arguing about territorial rights for generations, and they will never agree on anything." "Maybe they're asking the wrong question," Jake replied thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" "They're all fighting over who owns the system, but none of them are talking about what they actually need from it. The Zentari need the rare metals for their technology, the Vorth need the energy crystals for their power systems, and the Hegemony just wants to make sure the trade routes stay safe." Lyra looked confused. "But that is how disputes are resolved. The strongest claim wins and the others must accept it." "That works when there's only enough for one group," Jake said. "But what if there's actually enough for everyone?" Before Lyra could ask what he meant, Jake got up and walked down to the negotiation chamber. The 3 delegations were taking another break and complaining loudly about each other to anyone who would listen. Jake approached the Zentari delegation first, since they seemed the most reasonable. "Excuse me," Jake said to their leader. "I'm Captain Morrison from Earth. I couldn't help but notice your disagreement with the other groups." The Zentari representative looked surprised that a human was speaking to him directly. "This is not a matter for your species, Captain. You lack the standing to participate in such important discussions." "I'm not trying to participate," Jake replied calmly. "I just had a question about the resources you need from that system." Despite himself, the Zentari seemed curious. "What kind of question?" "You need the rare metals for manufacturing, right? How much do you actually need per year?" The representative gave Jake a number that was much smaller than he had expected. Jake then went to the Vorth delegation and asked the same type of question about energy crystals. Their needs were also much more limited than he had thought. Finally, he spoke with the Hegemony about their security concerns and learned that they mainly wanted to prevent pirates from using the system as a base. Jake thought about the problem for several hours, while Lyra watched him with growing interest. She had never seen anyone approach a diplomatic crisis from this angle before. Instead of focusing on legal arguments or displays of power, Jake was treating it like a practical problem that needed a practical solution. The next morning, Jake requested permission to address all 3 delegations at the same time. The request was so unusual that the station administrators agreed out of curiosity. Jake stood before the 3 groups and presented his idea in simple terms. "You're all fighting over ownership, but you don't actually need to own the whole system," he began. "The Zentari need mining rights to specific asteroids. The Vorth need access to 3 planets with crystal deposits, and the Hegemony needs to station patrol ships in the system. There's no overlap between these requirements. The 3 delegations looked skeptical, but Jake continued with his proposal. Instead of one group owning everything, they could form a joint operation where each species controlled the resources they actually needed while sharing the costs of system defense and infrastructure. Development. The Zentari get their metals, the Vorth get their crystals, and the Hegemony gets paid to protect everyone's operations from pirates. The profits are split based on contribution rather than territorial claims. The idea was so different from normal diplomatic solutions that none of the delegations knew how to respond at first. However, after several hours of discussion, they realized that Jake's proposal would actually give each of them more of what they wanted than they could get through fighting. The agreement was signed 2 days later and became known as the Harmony Accord, since it was the first major diplomatic success in the station's history. Jake received formal thanks from all 3 species, and several other groups asked him to help with their own disputes. Princess Lyra watched all of this with amazement. She had grown up believing that humans were primitive creatures, with no understanding of civilization or politics. However, Jake had solved a problem that had defeated some of the galaxy's most experienced diplomats. "How did you know that would work?" she asked him privately after the signing ceremony. "I didn't know for sure," Jake admitted, "but I've learned that most fights happen because people assume they understand what the other side wants without actually asking them." Lyra realized that Jake's approach to problem-solving was completely different from anything she had been taught. Instead of trying to dominate others or prove his superiority, he looked for ways to help everyone get what they needed. It was a radical concept in galactic politics, but it clearly worked. When the Dominion officials returned to collect Lyra, they found her writing detailed reports about human diplomatic capabilities and recommending that Jake be invited to participate in larger negotiations. The reports were so compelling that they were sent directly to the highest levels of the Dominion government, where they caught the attention of some very important people. The Crystal Palace on Dominion Prime was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. The entire structure seemed to be carved from a single massive gem that caught and reflected light in ways that made the walls appear to move and breathe. Jake walked through the corridors next to Princess Lyra, who had insisted on serving as his guide and cultural advisor for the Galactic Summit. "Remember that rank and precedence matter greatly here," Lyra whispered as they approached the main conference chamber. "Each species has a specific place in the hierarchy based on age, technology, and military power. Humans are considered newcomers, so you will be seated in the lowest position." Jake nodded but didn't seem bothered by this information. He had read everything available about the 12 major civilizations that would be represented at the summit. Most of them had been spacefaring for thousands of years, while humans had only achieved faster than light travel 50 years ago. From their perspective, he was essentially a child trying to sit at the adult table. The conference chamber was enormous, with seating arranged in ascending tiers that clearly showed each species' relative importance. At the top sat the ancient, ethereals, beings of pure energy who rarely bothered with physical form. Below them were the machine-like constructors, who had built most of the galaxy's major infrastructure projects. Each level down represented less power and influence until the bottom tier, where Jake found his assigned seat. The other delegates barely acknowledged his presence when he entered the room. A few looked at him with obvious curiosity, since most had never seen a human before. But the majority ignored him completely. Jake settled into his chair and observed the complex social interactions happening around him. "The tall ones with the crystal formations on their heads are the architects," Lyra explained quietly. "They design cities and habitats for other species. The floating squid-like creatures are the navigators who control most of the major trade routes. The ones that look like living metal are from the Forge worlds." Jake studied each delegation carefully, noting how they interacted with each other and where the real power relationships lay. He could see that some species were natural allies, while others barely tolerated each other's presence. The seating arrangement told part of the story, but the body language and subtle gestures revealed much more. The summit was called to address the growing pirate crisis that threatened trade throughout the galaxy. Attacks on merchant vessels had increased by 300% over the past year, and traditional security measures were proving inadequate. The pirates seemed to know exactly when and where to strike, suggesting they had access to inside information. For 3 days, Jake listened to the same solutions being proposed over and over again. The military-focused species wanted more warships patrolling the trade routes. The technology-based civilizations suggested better sensors and communication systems. The economic powers proposed higher rewards for information leading to pirate bases. All of these ideas had been tried before with minimal success. The pirates simply adapted their tactics and found new ways to avoid detection. Jake could see that the delegates were becoming frustrated with the lack of progress, but none of them seemed willing to consider fundamentally different approaches. On the 4th day, the ethereal representative made a formal statement that shocked everyone in the chamber. Perhaps we should hear from the newest member of our galactic community. The human perspective might offer insights that our experienced minds have overlooked. Jake was surprised to be called upon, but he stood up and walked to the central speaking platform. He could feel hundreds of alien eyes focused on him and sense the skepticism radiating from most of the delegates. This was clearly meant to be a token gesture rather than a serious request for input. "Thank you for this opportunity," Jake began simply. "I've been listening to your discussions for several days, and I think you might be solving the wrong problem." A murmur of disapproval ran through the chamber. Several delegates exchanged glances that clearly said they had expected the primitive human to embarrass himself. Jake continued calmly. "You're treating this as a security issue, but the evidence suggests it's actually an economic and social problem. The attacks aren't random, and they're not just about stealing cargo." "Explain," commanded the constructor representative in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "The pirates know exactly which ships to target and when those ships will be vulnerable. That level of intelligence requires extensive networks of informants. People don't usually betray their own communities unless they have good reasons." Jake activated a holographic display that showed the pattern of attacks over the past year. He had spent his free time analyzing the data and looking for connections that others had missed. Most of the attacks happen in systems where recent colonial failures have left large populations without work or resources. The pirates aren't just criminals, they're refugees who turned to piracy because they had no other options. The navigator representative floated closer to examine Jake's data. "You suggest that economic desperation drives these attacks rather than simple greed." "Exactly. Look at the timing and locations. Every major increase in pirate activity corresponds with the collapse of a colonial venture or the closure of mining operations. The people affected have ships and skills, but no legitimate way to use them." Jake's analysis revealed patterns that the other delegates had completely missed. They had been so focused on the symptoms of the problem that they had ignored the underlying causes. The pirates weren't mysterious criminals operating from hidden bases. They were displaced populations fighting for survival. "This is interesting." "Theory," admitted the architect delegate. "But how do you propose to address it?" "Create legitimate opportunities instead of just increasing security patrols. Establish trade cooperatives that can absorb displaced workers. Offer amnesty programs for pirates who agree to join authorized salvage and rescue operations. Give people better options, and most of them will take those options." The chamber fell silent as the delegates considered this radically different approach. Several of them began accessing their own databases to verify Jake's analysis. Within minutes, it became clear that his theory was not only correct but had been staring them in the face for months. The ethereal representative spoke first. "The human has identified connections that our intelligence services missed. His proposed solutions address root causes rather than symptoms." Other delegates began nodding agreement and asking Jake detailed questions about implementation. Princess Lyra watched from her position in the Dominion section with obvious pride as Jake answered each question thoughtfully and practically. However, not everyone was pleased with Jake's success. Several of the more conservative delegations viewed his ideas as dangerous challenges to established order. The hegemony representatives stood up and addressed the chamber directly. These proposals ignore fundamental realities of galactic politics. The human suggests treating pirates as victims rather than criminals. Such weakness will only encourage more lawlessness. It's not weakness to solve problems instead of just fighting symptoms, Jake replied respectfully. Military action has its place, but it can't address economic and social issues. The debate continued for hours, with delegates arguing passionately on both sides. Jake found himself defending not just his ideas, but humanity's right to participate in galactic affairs. Some species clearly viewed humans as upstart primitives who should be grateful to observe their betters rather than offering suggestions. Princess Lyra surprised everyone by standing up and formally endorsing Jake's proposals. As a member of the royal family, her opinion carried significant weight with several neutral delegations. Other allies began emerging as well, species who had been quietly frustrated with traditional approaches but had lacked alternatives. By the end of the day, Jake's proposals had been accepted for limited trial implementation. Several systems would experiment with the economic and social solutions while maintaining traditional security measures as backup. It was a compromise, but it represented the first major policy change in galactic anti-piracy efforts for over a century. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them approached Jake to express their interest in working with humans on other issues. The species that had initially dismissed him as a primitive curiosity were now treating him as a valuable ally with unique insights. However, Jake also noticed that some delegates avoided him completely and seemed to be having intense, private conversations with each other. His success had clearly made him enemies as well as friends, and Princess Lyra's public support had associated her with his controversial ideas. "You have made quite an impression," Lyra said as they walked back toward their quarters. "However, you should be aware that some very powerful people are not pleased with today's developments." "I figured as much," Jake replied. "Change is never popular with people who benefit from the status quo. The question now is whether you and your species are prepared for the consequences of challenging the established order. The galaxy can be a dangerous place for those who threaten powerful interests." Jake looked at Lyra seriously. "Are you trying to warn me about something specific?" P. The throne chamber of Queen Zara was the most magnificent room Jake had ever entered. The ceiling stretched up so high that it disappeared into shadows, while the walls were covered with murals depicting the history of the Celestial Dominion's conquest of countless worlds. At the center of the vast space sat a throne that seemed to be carved from a single black crystal, and on that throne sat the most powerful being in the known galaxy. Queen Zara looked similar to her daughter, but with an ageless quality that suggested she had ruled for centuries. Her eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who had made decisions that affected billions of lives and never lost sleep over the consequences. When she looked at Jake, he felt like she was seeing directly into his soul and evaluating everything she found there. "Approach," Queen Zara commanded in a voice that echoed through the chamber. Jake walked forward until he reached the designated spot where visitors were supposed to stop and bow. However, instead of the elaborate display of submission that was customary, Jake simply nodded respectfully and waited for the Queen to speak. Several court officials gasped at this breach of protocol, but the Queen herself seemed amused rather than offended. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Captain Morrison," the Queen said with a slight smile. "Most beings grovel when they enter my presence." "I don't grovel for anyone, Your Majesty," Jake replied calmly. "I show respect to those who earn it through their actions, not their titles." Princess Lyra stood with the other court observers and watched nervously as her mother and Jake faced each other. She knew that the Queen was testing Jake in ways that could determine not just his fate, but the future relationship between humanity and the Dominion. My daughter has written extensive reports about your species and your capabilities, Queen, Zara continued. She claims that humans possess unique qualities that could benefit galactic civilization. However, I prefer to make my own judgments. The Queen gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them. It showed a complex scenario involving multiple star systems, trade routes, and political relationships. Jake recognized it as some kind of test or simulation. You will face a situation that has no perfect solution, the Queen explained. A critical alliance partner demands that you sacrifice a human colony to prove your loyalty. Refusing will cost you the alliance and leave humanity isolated in a dangerous galaxy. Accepting will save millions of other human lives, but require you to abandon thousands to certain death. Jake studied the scenario carefully while the assembled court watched in silence. This was clearly a test that other species had faced before, and there was probably a traditional answer that demonstrated proper understanding of galactic politics. Every previous delegate has chosen based on the greater good, Queen Zara said, reading his thoughts. They sacrifice the few to save the many, which shows they understand the harsh realities of survival in space. Jake continued analyzing the situation, but something bothered him about the premise. The scenario assumed that the alliance partners' demand was reasonable and that the two options presented were the only possibilities. However, his experience at Harmony Station had taught him to question such assumptions. I reject the premise of your test, Jake said finally. A shocked silence fell over the throne chamber. No one had ever challenged one of the Queen's tests before, and the court officials looked scandalized by Jake's response. Explain, Queen Zara commanded, though her tone suggested she was more intrigued than angry. This scenario assumes that our alliance partner has legitimate reasons for making this demand and that we have no other options besides compliance or isolation. But in the real galaxy, situations like this usually involve someone trying to manipulate you into making a choice that benefits them. Jake gestured toward the holographic display and began pointing out details that others had apparently missed. The timing is suspicious. The demand seems designed to test our resolve rather than serve any practical purpose. And the consequences of refusal are probably exaggerated to pressure us into compliance. And your solution? The Queen asked. Find out what the alliance partner really wants and offer them a better way to get it. If they're testing our loyalty, prove it through actions that don't require sacrificing innocent people. If they're trying to weaken humanity, expose their agenda and find different allies. Queen Zara leaned forward slightly, showing the first sign of genuine interest since Jake had entered the chamber. You would risk everything on the assumption that there is always a third option. I would risk everything on the principle that innocent people's lives aren't bargaining chips, Jake replied firmly. Any alliance that requires us to abandon that principle isn't worth having. The Queen stood up from her throne and walked down the steps until she was standing directly in front of Jake. At this distance, he could see that her eyes held not just intelligence, but also a deep weariness that came from centuries of making impossible choices. Most species learn to accept compromise as the price of survival, she said quietly. They sacrifice their ideals gradually until they become indistinguishable from the enemies they once fought. You suggest that humans will never reach that point. I suggest that humans will find different ways to survive, Jake answered. We're not better than other species, but we approach problems differently. Sometimes that different perspective is exactly what a situation needs. Queen Zara returned to her throne and sat in silence for several minutes, while the entire court waited to learn Jake's fate. Princess Lyra looked increasingly worried as the silence stretched on, because she knew her mother was capable of ordering Jake's execution for his defiance of established protocols. Finally, the Queen spoke again. Tell me, Captain Morrison, what are your intentions toward my daughter? The question caught Jake completely off guard. He had expected more political testing, but this was clearly personal. He glanced toward Princess Lyra and saw her looking equally surprised by her mother's directness. "I respect Princess Lyra as an intelligent person who has shown me kindness," Jake said carefully. "She's helped me understand galactic politics and culture in ways that have made this summit possible." "That is not what I asked," Queen Zara replied with steel in her voice. "My daughter has been influenced by her contact with your species. She questions traditions that have maintained order for thousands of years. She speaks of partnerships rather than proper hierarchies. I want to know if you encourage these dangerous ideas." Jake realized that he was standing at a crucial moment, not just for himself, but for the future relationship between humans and the Dominion. Princess Lyra had clearly been changed by her interactions with his crew, and her mother viewed those changes as a threat to established order. "Princess Lyra's ideas are her own," Jake said honestly. "I never tried to convince her of anything. We just talked about different ways of looking at problems and relationships." "And what is your opinion of those different ways?" the Queen pressed. Jake looked directly into Queen Zara's eyes and gave her the truth. "I think partnership is stronger than hierarchy because it's based on choice rather than force. People fight harder for things they believe in than for things they're ordered to do, even when those choices lead to chaos and disorder." "Sometimes chaos is better than the wrong kind of order," Jake replied. "At least with chaos, you have the possibility of finding something better." Queen Zara smiled for the first time since Jake had entered the throne chamber. It was not a pleasant expression, and it made several court officials step backward nervously. "You are either the most naive being I've ever encountered or the most dangerous," she said. "Your ideas challenge everything that holds galactic civilization together." "Maybe galactic civilization needs to be challenged," Jake suggested. "From what I've seen, your current system creates a lot of problems while solving very few." The Queen's smile widened into something that was definitely not friendly. "And you believe that humanity can do better?" "I believe that humanity can try different approaches," Jake corrected. "We might fail, but at least we'll fail while trying to build something better rather than just maintaining something that doesn't work." Queen Zara stood up again, and this time her expression was completely unreadable. Jake prepared himself for anything from execution to exile, while Princess Lyra watched with obvious fear for his safety. "You have given me much to consider, Captain Morrison," the Queen said finally. "Your species brings perspectives that are both refreshing and terrifying. The question is whether the galaxy is ready for such changes." Jake waited for her verdict, while trying not to show how nervous he had become. Everything depended on whether this ancient ruler could accept the possibility that her way of doing things might not be the only way or the best way. "Tomorrow you will address the full Galactic Council," Queen Zara announced. "They will decide whether humanity deserves a permanent voice in galactic affairs. I suggest you prepare carefully because your enemies will be waiting for any sign of weakness." As Jake was escorted from the throne chamber, he realized that his real test was just beginning. The Queen had given him an opportunity, but she had also put him in a position where failure would destroy any chance of humanity finding acceptance among the stars. The Grand Assembly of the Dominion was unlike anything Jake had experienced during the previous summit meetings. Representatives from over 50 species filled the enormous chamber, while holographic displays showed dozens more participating from distant worlds. The air hummed with tension as beings who rarely agreed on anything prepared to debate humanity's future in galactic civilization. Jake stood in the center of the assembly floor, while Queen Zara observed from her elevated platform. Princess Lyra sat with the Dominion delegation, but her eyes were fixed on Jake with an expression of worry and determination. He knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the relationship between their two species for generations to come. "The human will now present his case for permanent membership in the Galactic Council," Queen Zara announced to the assembly. All recognized species may question him regarding his proposals and qualifications. Jake had spent the previous night preparing for this moment, but he knew that no amount of preparation could account for every possible challenge. He looked around the assembly and saw faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Many of these beings viewed humans as primitive newcomers who had no business participating in decisions that affected advanced civilizations. Honored representatives, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. I stand before you not to claim that humanity deserves special treatment, but to suggest that our differences might be exactly what the galaxy needs right now. A rumble of skeptical voices rose from several sections of the assembly. The hegemony representative stood up immediately to challenge Jake's opening statement. The human speaks of differences as advantages, the alien said in a voice like grinding stone. However, inexperience and primitive thinking are weaknesses, not strengths. What can a species that has barely left its home system teach civilizations that have thrived for millennia? Jake had expected this challenge, and he answered calmly. You're absolutely right that we lack experience with galactic politics and advanced technology. However, sometimes an outside perspective can see solutions that experts miss because they're too close to the problem. Give us an example, demanded the constructor representative. The pirate crisis that has plagued trade. Roots for decades, Jake replied. Your military and intelligence experts focused on security measures and enforcement while missing the economic and social factors that create pirates in the first place. Sometimes being new to a situation means you don't have preconceived notions about how it should be solved. Several representatives began murmuring among themselves as they recalled Jake's successful analysis during the previous summit. However, the ethereal delegate raised a more fundamental objection. Even if humans occasionally offer useful insights, that does not justify full membership in galactic governance. Many species contribute valuable perspectives without requiring formal representation. Jake nodded respectfully to the ancient being of pure energy. That's a fair point. But I'm not just asking for consultation rights. I'm proposing that humanity can serve as a bridge between species that have trouble communicating with each other. Explain this bridge concept, Queen Zara commanded from her platform. Humans haven't been around long enough to develop the old grudges and territorial disputes that complicate relationships between established civilizations. We can mediate conflicts because we don't have centuries of history with either side. Jake activated a holographic display showing the recent resolution at Harmony Station. When the Zentari, Vorth, and Hegemony were deadlocked over territorial claims, they couldn't find common ground because each species saw the others as traditional rivals. As newcomers, we could focus on practical solutions instead of historical grievances. The navigator representative floated closer to examine the display. This is one example of successful mediation. Can you demonstrate that such results can be replicated? Before Jake could answer, Princess Lyra surprised everyone by standing up and requesting permission to speak. Queen Zara looked displeased by her daughter's intervention but granted the request. Honored assembly, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I have observed human capabilities firsthand during several weeks of close contact. Their approach to problem-solving consistently produces results that traditional methods cannot achieve. The princess speaks from personal attachment rather than objective analysis, sneered the hegemony representative. Her judgment has been compromised by extended exposure to primitive influences. Jake felt anger rise in his chest at the insult to Lyra, but he forced himself to remain calm. However, Lyra's response surprised him with its intensity. My judgment has been enhanced by exposure to different perspectives, she replied firmly. The human approach to partnership and cooperation offers alternatives to the rigid hierarchies that have stagnated galactic progress for centuries. Queen Zara's expression grew cold as she realized her daughter was publicly challenging fundamental principles of Dominion society. The assembly fell silent as they witnessed what amounted to a royal rebellion against established order. "Princess Lyra," the queen said in a voice that carried clear warning, "you forget your position and your duties to your people." "I remember my duties perfectly, Mother," Lyra replied with surprising strength. "My duty is to help our civilization grow and adapt, rather than simply maintaining traditions that no longer serve us well." Jake realized that Lyra was risking everything to support his proposals, and he couldn't let her face the consequences alone. He stepped forward and addressed Queen Zara directly. "Your Majesty, Princess Lyra's support for humanity comes from her own observations and conclusions. If you want to understand what she sees in our species, perhaps you should ask her what she's learned, rather than dismissing her judgment." The queen's eyes blazed with anger at being challenged so directly in front of the entire assembly. For a moment, Jake thought she might order his immediate execution for such unprecedented disrespect. Instead, Queen Zara surprised everyone by asking, "Very well, Princess Lyra, tell this assembly exactly what you have learned from your association with humans." Lyra took a deep breath and looked around the chamber before answering. "I have learned that strength comes from unity freely chosen, rather than obedience forced through hierarchy. I have seen humans risk their lives for each other not because they were ordered to do so, but because they chose to value each other's welfare above their own safety." She paused and looked directly at Jake, before continuing. "I have also learned that partnership between equals produces better results than domination by superiors. When beings work together as partners, they combine their strengths instead of simply following the directions of whoever has the most power." The assembly erupted in arguments as delegates debated the implications of Lyra's statements. Some species were intrigued by her ideas, while others viewed them as dangerous threats to galactic stability. Queen Zara raised her hand for silence, and the chamber gradually quieted. "Princess Lyra proposes fundamental changes to the principles that have governed galactic civilization for thousands of years. Such changes cannot be made lightly or without careful consideration of their consequences." "Then let us test those principles," Jake suggested boldly. "Grant humanity provisional membership in the Galactic Council and judge us by our results rather than our theories. And if humans prove inadequate to the responsibilities of galactic governance," asked the architect representative, "then remove us from the council and go back to doing things the way you always have," Jake replied. "But if we succeed in helping solve problems that traditional approaches can't handle, then maybe it's time to consider new ways of organizing galactic society." Queen Zara stood up from her throne, and the entire assembly fell silent. Everyone knew that her next words would determine not just humanity's future, but possibly the direction of galactic civilization itself. The human proposes that we gamble the stability of our established order on the untested theories of a primitive species, she said slowly. Such a gamble could lead to chaos and destruction if their methods prove inadequate. Jake felt his heart sink as the queen seemed to be rejecting his proposals. However, her next words surprised him completely. "However," she continued, "our established order has also failed to solve many persistent problems despite centuries of effort. Perhaps it is time to accept that different approaches might succeed where traditional methods have failed." The queen looked directly at Jake and then at her daughter before making her announcement. "Humanity will be granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council, with Princess Lyra serving as their designated liaison and cultural advisor. This arrangement will be evaluated after 1 year based on measurable results." The assembly erupted in shocked voices as delegates realized what had just happened. Queen Zara had not only accepted Jake's proposals, but had also formally assigned her own daughter to work with humanity as an equal partner rather than a superior advisor. Jake looked at Princess Lyra and saw her smiling with tears in her eyes. She had risked her relationship with her mother and her position in Dominion society to support his vision of partnership between species.